Hi, I'm Rich Rubino, and I just wrote my fifth book, and it's entitled The Great American Political Trivia Challenge, Political Trivia on Steroids. And it's about 500 pages of mostly bizarre, mostly bizarre, sometimes interesting political facts from American history, going back all the way from the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union to the Jersey Shore.
Look at that. That was like a boom right there. I like it. Just dive right in there. Okay, so we're going to talk about the book because I received the book.
Yes.
Holy moly. Like, no joke, amazing in every single way, but holy moly, there's a lot of facts in there. So we're going to talk about that. So much. It's like literally when it arrived, I'm like, what is this? And then I was like, oh, we're gonna have fun with this. But let's start at the beginning.
Okay.
Little Rich Rubino. Where are you? Where are you from? Who are you? Up to the point where you are. Let's bring the audience up to the point you're in college.
Okay. Okay. So I was in college. I went to Assumption.
No. Come on, no.
What are you looking for?
Little, starting from when you're small. Where are you?
I thought you said starting from when I was in college.
No, literally, I go from where little you all the way up to college.
Oh, I get it. Okay, I misapprehended. Okay. So when I was young, let's start when I was about 9 years old. How's that?
Well, where are you from?
Oh, okay. Well, I grew up in. Okay, I get it. This is just
we're gonna have a good time here.
This is too complicated. The questions are too complicated. So I grew up in Marblehead, and I went to Marblehead Public Schools, and I've had this perpetual interest in politics, and it really began, I think, when I was probably about 9 or 10 years old. I was one of the people that liked those presidential figurines, and I like to count them, and I like to put them all, and look at some of the more obscure presidents. And then for some reason, when the town got cable, I started watching C-SPAN. And I actually dedicated the book to C-SPAN, believe it or not, which is kind of rare because my guess is most people do not dedicate the book to C-SPAN. So I wanted to do something a little bit obscure. So I did that because I had that interest, and I would come home and I'd like to watch congressional hearings, special orders, that type of stuff. So I kind of always liked that, and I like journalism as well. I always wanted to kind of amalgamate the two. So I kind of all through I guess my rudimentary years, I followed the political process. Then I went to college. I studied communications and political science.
I'm going to pause you because you're going really, really fast. So see, this is where I come in and I'm going to stop. Okay, so you're 9 years old and you realize this, but was there anyone in your family that got you into no one? So you just like all of a sudden one day you just said, hey, I'm going to learn about. But what was it that triggered that? Because where did it come from that all of a sudden this 9-year-old is interested?
Yeah, no, it's a fascinating question. I don't know where it came. I don't know where it actually came from, other than I remember looking at the presidential figurines, and I remember looking at presidential charts, and for some reason having an interest. Now, where that effectuated, I don't know, but I know that was part of it. And I do know that when I would come home, and for some reason, I just got kind of, I guess, a gravitational pull towards C-SPAN. Now, where that came from, I don't know, but I just definitely had that interest, and it was kind of interesting because other people didn't really have that interest. And I was interested in other things too. I like, baseball cards, that type of thing. But for some reason, the political process, just kind of, I guess, the Byzantine parts of it, following it, watching congressional hearings, that type of thing, just for some reason, there was an interest there.
So I worked in politics. I was one of the press secretaries for Governor Romney. And I'm first generation born in America. I'm from Haiti, where politics is a shit show on a good day. On a good day, it's a shit show. And so for me, I never wanted to get into politics whatsoever. So I'm sitting in a poli-sci class and I'm just bored. I mean, U.S. history, I'm just bored. Literally, it wasn't for me because I knew of the travesties that were happening in my country. When you're watching, and when you're at that age, you're learning about and watching things about politics, but you're seeing how it's reacting in the real world. So you're watching it on TV, but it's still around you. So you're hearing adult conversations, you're seeing how people are reacting. How was it that what was it that still compelled you to actually really enjoy it at that age zone? Because most people, especially for me, it was a turnoff because I saw people getting harmed by politics. and I never took the time to learn the benefits of it.
Well, it's interesting, first of all, you brought up Haiti, because I do remember actually right around the early 90s, I remember the whole issue with the coup against Aristide. And I remember Cedras coming in. This is actually something I followed very closely. And then 1994, when I was 16 years old, I can remember the US was essentially on the precipice of invading Haiti. And this was to bring Jean-Bertrand Aristide back into power. And at the very last ditch effort, President Clinton sent Jimmy Carter, Colin Powell, and Sam Nunn to Haiti to basically try to persuade Raoul Cedras to leave the country. And at the very final hour, he essentially did, and that essentially prevented an invasion. But I actually remember following the whole Haiti thing very closely, so that is something that interested me. But it's interesting.
And you were 16 years old.
I remember it very well. I remember the whole Haitian thing. I remember the whole issue. I remember it was an issue going back to the '92 campaign. And then I remember 93, and then I remember Bill Clinton. I remember making it. I remember you had Somalia first in 1993, and it was interesting because it shows there the effects that the media can have. When it was called the "quote unquote" CNN effect. When CNN and other networks started covering what was going on in Somalia, there was a movement in this country to send U.S. troops to Somalia. And George H.W. Bush, one of the last things he did as president was that he sent troops to Somalia. But then once the troops were actually in Somalia, when Bill Clinton succeeded him, and there was an instance where there was what the movie Black Hawk Down shows that essentially there were a U.S. troop, and there were a bunch of Somalis, and they had him on the ground, and they were kind of dragging him. And that showed up on CNN. And then the alternative to the CNN effect is people are now saying, bring the troops home. So it showed the kind of omnipotence, I guess, of the media. At that time, you only had one major cable news network, but that was that was something that interested me. And then Haiti essentially was going on Haiti was kind of in the shadows. Then once the Somalia crisis, once the troops started to come home from Somalia, Haiti kind of took center stage. And throughout 1994, remember, first there was economic sanctions on Haiti. And then I remember the United States coming very close to an invasion. I remember there were some folks on the right and the left who were very much against that, but it came very close. And at the very end, there was not an invasion. And essentially, then I remember U.S. troops, they did send about 20,000 troops to Haiti and essentially to restore hope or to restore peace. But that was something that actually worked out in terms of there not being an invasion. That is something that interested me.
Okay. So wait. So now I'm not interested. Look, I'm sorry. I'm interested in Haiti, obviously, like where my family's from. But now I'm interested in Rich's brain. Okay. Oh. You are retaining this information. And I mean, obviously you started when you were younger. So you are this is your thing. I mean, like photography is my thing. This is your thing. So I'm going to test the waters here.
Yes.
I'm going to pick countries. And I want you to say something about the relationship with U.S. history. And I mean, are you game for that?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Okay, all right. This is gonna be fun.
Oh boy.
All right, Iran.
Interesting. So here's the thing about Iran: the people don't realize that Iran actually had a democratic government, and in 1953, Mohammad Mossadegh, essentially the prime minister of Iran, decided he was going to nationalize the oil companies. So when he nationalized the oil companies, there was a plan. It actually began, Harry Truman nixed it, but CIA, for essentially there to be a coup in Iran to take out Mohammad Mossadegh and to install him, to supplant him with the Shah of Iran. So the Truman administration nixed it. Eisenhower comes in 1953. He goes ahead with it. So there's a coup, and they actually take out the democratically elected government in Iran, the United States, with some of their allies within the Iranian system. They put the Shah of Iran in, and the Shah of Iran stays in essentially till 1979. But in 1979, there is a coup against the Shah. Part of it, the Shah was he was a very despotic, very truculent leader. And by 1979, he was somebody who anyone who dissented essentially would be beaten. Especially anyone who tried to envelop themselves to stay in the freedom of the press. So there was a lot of animosity toward the United States, to the point that in 1979 there was essentially the quote unquote hostage crisis, and they took United States hostages, and essentially this became enveloped the Jimmy Carter's presidency, his last 2 years in office, trying to get those troops home. became a huge issue. There was a lot of animosity in Iran to the United States, and it became a big issue in the 1980 presidential campaign. Jimmy Carter loses that race, only wins 6 states, but then toward the last days in office, Warren Christopher, the Deputy Secretary of State, launches what was called the Algiers Accord, where essentially there was reciprocity. There was a deal. The United States agreed not to intervene in Iran's internal affairs. In return, the hostages would be freed. So Jimmy Carter, on his last day of office, is working on it. Then President Reagan comes in. He sends Carter over to greet the hostages. Then we have the Iran-Iraq war after that, where the United States was at least supporting Saddam Hussein in Iraq, but at the same time, they were also selling arms to Iran in return. We're selling arms essentially. We're selling arms to Iran and using the proceeds to fund the Contras in Nicaragua. That involved that was where the whole Iran-Contra thing came. I'll make this really short. And then part of the other reason that this was animosity toward the United States was the economic sanctions that they later on put on Iran, and how the effects they had on the people of Iran, which also contributed to animosity. But there have been instances where there have been some democratically closely aligned United States presidents, but in 2002.
Wait, no. I gotta go, because you can go on. So I'm going to sit there because there's so much to talk about. But I'm going to shoot out 4 more countries. But I want really short, tight answers.
Okay, got it.
Bulgaria.
Okay, I'll make this as short as I can. All I can say is that it was an issue certainly during the Cold War, and I think Eugene McCarthy, senator from Minnesota, was talking to Robert McNamara, the United States Secretary of Defense, and the Secretary of Defense was talking about how many tanks we have, and he said specifically, we have this many tanks, and that's more than the entire country of Bulgaria. And I'll just make this short. Eugene McCarthy looks at him and says, why did you choose the country of Bulgaria? Do you have some sort of a Bulgaria absolute or something? So that's as short as I can do that.
Okay. Let's go to Madagascar.
I can't tell you much relevant about Madagascar other than it is a relatively small country in Africa.
Okay. I like the whole entire stumping here. My last one, let's see, where do I want to go? Let's go to Taiwan.
Okay. Well, so Taiwan was known as Formosa, and there was so I'll try to integrate this into United States politics. So essentially, when China went to the communists, in other words, there's an issue between what is really China. Is it Taiwan or is it mainland China? And obviously, there are just a few more people in mainland China than there are in Taiwan. But that's my geography lesson for the day. So during the Truman administration, when mainland China went to the communists, the Republicans tried to essentially make this an incubus around President Truman's neck. So in 1952, Truman's extremely unpopular. He's got a 22% job approval rating. No U.S. president in the history of polling has been lower. And they tried to run against Truman that year, but Truman couldn't run for re-election. He lost the New Hampshire primary. So the eventual nominee was Adlai Stevenson. Adlai Stevenson, the incumbent governor of Illinois. Yep. But instead of running against Stevenson, they tried to run against Truman, and they ran against Korea because the Korean War was continuing, and the United States was continuing to be involved in. So the Korean War, and then communism, in part because of what was going on in China, saying essentially who lost China, fairly or unfairly. They were trying to blame Truman. And corruption, because there was some corruption within specifically the IRS, but within the Truman administration. So Taiwan became kind of a huge issue. And it's still an issue today. There were still, some senators, when Jesse Helms was in office, for example, North Carolina, he always said that, we should recognize Taiwan as essentially China. Was really go back to the Carter administration when Jimmy Carter said we're going to essentially normalize relations with China and establish China as officially, anyways, as the actual government of as the actual mainland China as the government of China, as opposed to what was Formosa and now Taiwan.
All right. So full disclosure, Rich lives in my town. I see Rich. I see Rich all the time. Rich has a big, beautiful brown dog. What is he?
He's a British chocolate lab.
Okay, he's a British chocolate lab. He's like the most chill dog, and it's his rule, it's his way. He'll walk when he walks. He'll sit when he walks, but he just like, everyone in town knows this dog. And so Rich and I started talking. And then of course, Rich said like, he goes, I've known you before when you were in politics. I'm like, I go, oh no, in radio. So
I met you. No, I was going to say, I actually met you. And you don't, I don't know if you remember this, but when I was in grad school, it was right when you were working for Governor Romney, and I was in the State House one time, and I remember I was walking by with a camera, and he was announcing a cabinet appointment, and I was looking in, seeing like, what's going on. You said, oh, come on in. And you invited me essentially in with the camera person to cover Mitt Romney's press conference. And I remember that press conference. I don't really remember the actual substance of it, but I remember at the end, John Keller was there, and John Keller asked his typical question that he would always ask of Mitt Romney. He would always say, essentially, we've had many drive-by governors in this state, and he would give off this litany of Weld, Dukakis, Weld, and Cellucci, meaning governors who were spending time out of state. And I remember him asking that. And I remember that was kind of his calling card, but I was very impressed with it, with being able to go into that press conference at the time. And then I saw you later on, and I said, oh yeah, and I don't think you remembered it, but I said, oh yeah, you were very nice to me, and you let me into that press conference to hear it. It was very educative for me.
Okay, so one, I don't remember it because like there's like so many people that come in press room. Number one, number two, it just cracks me up when people come in. They're like, do you remember? I'm like, my brain, I can't remember what I ate yesterday. So anyway, the reason why I said that, I go, literally, this is gonna be my fun game now. Whenever I see you, I'm going to throw out a country. I go and I'm going to hear the thing, and I'm like, okay, Rich, bye. But that's going to be my new thing that's our relationship back and forth from now on. Because I could go on for days, but there's other things I want to talk to you about. How did your parents deal with a child that's 9 years old, but like constantly like, I mean, these are adult conversations about what's happening in the world that are in politics. What did they do with you? They're like, how did they handle a child that's constantly absorbing everything about US history, everything about the politics, not only in the US, but all over the world? What did they do with that?
Well, that's a superlative question right there. I don't know. I guess they just kind of accepted it. I mean, they had very little interest in politics. So I always get questions. I want to say, you must come from a political family. It must have been in your blood. I say, no, they really were pretty blasé about it. They didn't really have much interest in it whatsoever. So it was something I really kind of did on my own. I would try to, I would watch a lot of this. I would try to watch or follow, and this is obviously before the internet, so you actually look at books in the library, but I tried to follow as much history, and I was always looking for comparisons between history and contemporaneous times, but it wasn't really anything that they influenced me on. I think they just kind of accepted that I was the young person who was just kind of entranced by C-SPAN for some reason.
What did the kids in school think of you? Because literally that's like one of those moments where there's like those individuals that are the Poindexters, the studious, I retain everything. There's the individuals that are the athletes, there's the individuals that are the artists. I mean, how did you, and we live in a small town. And so it's not like you're one of 10,000 that like, oh, we'll never see them. Everyone knows you because we're in a small town. So how were you received with individuals that were here? And also, did you connect with individuals that had the same love and passion? And then you guys basically found ways to communicate on a whole different level that most adults were like, what are they doing? Oh, they're just playing. But then they start listening to conversations. I'm like, oh my God, this is a high level conversation with these like young kids. Like, how is this happening? So how was that for you with your peers?
I never really discussed it with anybody. It was something I kind of did. I kind of did it on my own. I don't think there was anyone else that really had kind of the interest in it, but I was always kind of, although I would always kind of have, the one time I guess I would discuss it was when I would always like kind of the obscure information. For example, I remember the 92 campaign. Mm-hmm. And I remember because I remember there was a New Hampshire station, WNDS, and the signal you could actually hear in Marblehead, and you could watch it. So sometimes I remember when, in school, people discussing the major Democratic presidential candidates, Paul Tsongas, Tom Harkin, Jerry Brown, Doug Wilder, Bill Clinton, Bob Kerrey. But I remember watching, there were all these other candidates who run, and all you have to do is give $1,000 to the state of New Hampshire and get some, and essentially you're on the ballot. So I would always see like Tom Laughlin, for example, who acted as Kojak. I remember listening to him give speeches, and I'll say, oh, but what about these other people that are running? What about this person that's running? What about this person that's running? Yeah. And I remember being fascinated by that. And I remember also in papers, I'd always try to throw in kind of obscure figures. Like I remember the 92 campaign, obviously Clinton, Perot, and George H.W. Bush. But I would try to throw in, because I remember teachers saying that those were the three candidates. I would say, what about Andre Maru or Gary Maru, the libertarian candidate? And all of a sudden you should see people thinking probably, who essentially is this person?
Yeah.
So that was what I did enjoy. I did enjoy the obscure part of it, but it was nothing I actually kind of discussed with anybody, because I don't think anyone would really kind of have, the interest essentially that I would have. So I kind of didn't really disclose it that much.
What was your major in college?
Undergrad was political science and media communications. And that was at Assumption. And then Emerson, I did grad school. I did broadcast journalism. And that's where I had met you that time.
Yes. Why didn't you go into politics? Because you have such a grasp knowledge. I mean, you have a love. I mean, it's like your passion. Why didn't you go into, you went to Emerson for broadcasting, but why didn't you choose to go into the route of politics, whether it was behind the scenes or in front of the scenes, or did you?
Yeah. I mean, hindsight is 20/20, but looking back, I think I probably should have. I probably should have drawn something directly into politics. I always knew that I was going to amalgamate them somehow, but I thought essentially that it was going to be through journalism. And I remember when I was in grad school, I was very interested in politics and covering politics. And it was actually rare, because most of the students, most of my fellow pupils, I guess, were not necessarily into politics. They were more interested in either entertainment or news in general. So it wasn't something that it was something, well, let's put it this way. Whenever I wanted to do a political story with a partner or something, they would always invariably want to do it about something else. So I kind of tried to work myself into doing politics. And I remember, I remember always trying to figure out a way that I would get to the State House, that type of thing. But it was something that you're right, I probably should have done I probably should have done something directly into politics. It kind of worked its way into that. But if I had done it in hindsight, I would not have necessarily gone to grad school for journalism, but done something politically related, contrary wise.
Why do you think that? I mean, again, you are, when I tell you, I love a good brain. That's what I'm going to say. I love a good brain that stores great content. Although, how are you with birthdays and remembering things like that?
That's interesting. My short-term memory it's definitely a difference between
birthdays are not short-term memories. Birthdays are long-term memories.
Birthdays I'm okay with, but in terms of doing something and then trying to remember where I put something, or trying to remember, I'm really not that good at any of that whatsoever. So I think there's a difference. But also in terms of long-term memories, I may be good at politics and a couple of things, but there are a lot of things that my memory is not very good at. It's almost selective memory. In some respects, because I do remember in school actually struggling a lot, trying to remember facts, trying to remember things for tests, and sometimes you try to cram it, but it certainly was not something that came easy to me. It's just this very, very specific niche that's for some reason I retain. Other things, birthdays, I'm okay with birthdays, I guess, but in terms of where I put my keys, that can sometimes the struggle can be real.
How many books do you have right now?
5.
Yeah, 5 books. Tell me about the first 4.
Okay, so the first one is called The Political Bible of Little Known Facts in American Politics.
Wait, do you have them in front of you?
I don't have them in front of me, no.
What? How do you not come prepared? How do you not come prepared?
Let's see. I do have, oh wait, I do. Yes.
Okay. So that's the first one.
That's the first one.
Bible. Okay.
Yes. And that essentially effectuated because I had an interest in I was actually looking for books that were not just interesting presidential facts. I found a litany of those, but I was looking for one that was a little bit different. And I was looking for an angle rather that was just a little bit different. And so I thought, shouldn't there be something about politics specifically, but interesting facts from politics, everything from all 3 branches of government, as well as the states. And that gave me the impetus to write that one.
Okay.
So I did that one, and I did a book tour. And when I was asked questions, I was often asked about different quotes that I had in that book.
Okay.
So that gave the impetus to write my second book, which was called The Political Bible of Humorous Quotations in American Politics. Essentially interesting things that politicians have said, funny things that politicians have said, funny political quotes. So I went on a tour for that. And then there was an interregnum here. Then after that, I worked for a group called National Popular Vote, and their mission was to change the way the Electoral College the Electoral College allocates their votes. Basically, the Constitution states each state shall appoint in such a manner of the legislature thereof may direct a number of electors. So essentially, the states don't have to award their electoral votes to whoever wins their state. They can really do it. They have plenary authority to do it any way they want. So I did a book about that, about the Electoral College. And then after that, I wrote the third book. I guess it was this one right here, with the best cover, I think, American Politics on the Rocks. Essentially interesting political stories from American history, going from the founding to contemporaneous times. So that was quite a journey. I got them all on the boat right here, and you can see they have Acme on the engine right there, and you get all these politicians. So I did that one. That was interesting. And then I got the idea to kind of put it all together, because people would ask me, well, what about trivia? I would say that is a good idea, but if I'm going to do a trivia book, it shouldn't just be questions, answer. As much as I humanly can, I try to provide as much context toward the answer as possible, hence my fifth book.
Okay, so how do you, again, all the books are meaty, but this one I feel is the meatiest of all of them you've done. So how do you even begin this? Because I wrote a children's book, and it took a year because I wanted to do the research of making sure that I was factual in what I was creating. I have, crossing our fingers, 5 books coming out this year. Children's books, a marketing book, photography book, and a remedy book. And all those they take such time, because you want to make sure you have the great content. And the great content, the right people and engage. You want to make sure that you're doing your research to it, the design. How do you even begin to write a book that has so much? There's so much to it. Where do you start? And I know that, I think I should ask this for your first book, because every book intertwined to the next. But let's talk about that first. The first decision of, I'm going to write a book. I go, and it's going to be focused on the history. Yes, I have the love for it, but there's history in the US, depending on who you talk to, truths, false. So where do you start in regards of designing what you're going to do and digging to the truth?
That's a great question. It starts in the membrane, and which can be insane. And inside of that membrane, I was thinking about all the kind of stories and interesting political facts that I've kind of somehow stored there throughout history. So all of a sudden I thought, why don't I try to see if I can confirm some of this? So you go back to something, and it's interesting, because now that the internet, ever since Al Gore took the initiative in creating the internet, which actually that's why the reason I said that, by the way, is because that's actually what he said, meaning that he had given money for these for the superhighway when he was a senator from Tennessee. That's how the way he meant it. But the next day it came out is that he had invented the internet. And then Dick Armey, the House Majority Leader, comes from Texas, comes out and says, if Al Gore invented the internet, I invented the interstate, which is a great line. So at any rate, so that's where this all came from. So I decided I'll go back and I'll look for things. And it's interesting when you look for things, because now you can look at primary sources. You can actually go back to something that happened at that time. And every single time, just about that, you try to find something, and you find 7 or 8 other things that are kind of lost to history. Something that was a 1 or 2 day story, and all of a sudden you go back and you say, wow, that's interesting. I'm going to pick that up. Like, first example. So I was going back looking at the 92 campaign, because I remembered much from it. I remember I really followed the 88 and 92, 96 all specifically as a youngin. And I can remember there was this issue where, so Paul Tsongas, the former senator from Massachusetts, was trying to say that Bill Clinton was a pander bear, meaning that he pandered to constituencies. So he holds a press conference and has a panda bear. And he's trying to say this guy, he's a pander bear. But because of his accent, it sounded like he was saying panda bear. So the next day, the story was, why was Paul Tsongas calling Bill Clinton a panda bear? This was nonsensical. So it kind of blew up in his face. So I said, I'm going to look this up to try to find, where this came from. And I found a bunch of things about it. But then all of a sudden I find other things about that campaign. For example, Paul Tsongas in one of the debates is running against Bob Kerrey, the senator from Nebraska at the time. And Paul Tsongas, part of his slogan was, I'm no Santa Claus, meaning essentially that he cannot do everything that, for example, Bill Clinton wanted a middle class tax cut. Other Democrats wanted more social spending. Paul Tsongas wanted root canal economics. Essentially, he wanted to raise taxes and cut spending. So he said, I'm not Santa Claus. And at one point, Bob Kerry comes in and he says, well, you may not be Santa Claus, but you don't have to be the Grinch who stole Christmas either. And I thought that was a great line. And here's one other that I found at that time that it was kind of in the back of a story, which I found, wow, this is great. Ann Richards at the time, remember the incumbent governor of Texas, and she was Bill Clinton, Paul Tsongas, and Jerry Brown were all trying to get her endorsement. And she was staying neutral. And Paul Tsongas ran an ad where he was swimming. He said, Paul Tsongas swims against the tide. So he showed him swimming. He looks like he's in pretty good shape. The next day, Ann Richards says, I'm less likely to support a candidate who looks better in a bathing suit than I do. I said, that is a great line. That has to go in there.
So this is you, like I go, so now you're like picking and choosing all these different quotes that are coming in. How long does it take you to how long does one of these books take to create? Because again, all five have a lot of content. How long from beginning, I've decided to do this, or like I'm on number 2 and someone piques my interest, I'm like gonna do number 3. How long from beginning to end does it take for you to decide, start building up the content, the research to make sure that you're, like I go, it's factual. Yep. Yes, you have all this knowledge already, but I mean, this is not a faint of heart of a book. So, I mean, how long does it take? Because there's a lot of people during the pandemic that decided, like, I'm going to come up with a hobby, or I'm going to start talking about my expertise, or now I have the time to write that book that I never had the time to do. And so they think easy peasy, and then they realize it's so daunting, and then they just stop. So how long did it take you to do this? But also, what advice would you give to anyone that's looking? Because I say to everyone has a story in them. Everyone has a book in them, but then having it in you and actually doing it are two different things. So how long did it take for you to do any of your books? Like, what's the time frame that you put on yourself? And what advice would you give to someone that is thinking about it, but it has no idea where to start?
Yeah, this one took about 2.5 years. And I would say my other ones probably took about 1.5 to 2 years. And the one about the Electoral College probably took about 6 months or so, because that was obviously a smaller book, and that was somewhat of politics, but it's a different genre. In terms of how, it's interesting because, when you're in, at least for me, growing up, there are a lot of subjects in school that I could not pay attention to. I just could not pay attention to it. I mean, obviously, math specifically, but certainly science, it was very hard for me to do because it did not interest me, and I found it austere. I found it very hard. So as a result, I remember there was somebody came in an assembly one time in middle school or high school rather, and he said something that, if you have, the worst possible life is to think of your worst subject, and your worst subject, think about doing that all day long. And I remember thinking about that, and I'm trying to think of myself, doing geometry all day long, which I don't know how I passed geometry, but I remember trying to think about how I could, which I barely did literally, but how doing that all day long. So I think you have to do something that somehow you have a niche, because your brain, it's almost like it makes connections. If you think about it, when you're young, for example, and I remember this, I remember being in middle school and trying my hardest to try to pay attention to what was going on. And all you want to think about is something else. For example, it's very hard to train your brain. Your brain wants, somebody wants to teach you about the Peloponnesian War, and you want to think about skateboarding. And it's very hard to get your mind back on the Peloponnesian War. So if you can somehow figure out something that is kind of your alternative, if you will, your version of being a 6th grader and wanting to be involved in skateboarding or collecting baseball cards, and something that's very specific of interest in you. So essentially your avocation, if you will, can translate into your vocation, then I think you have an interest in doing it. If I was doing something about the Pythagorean theorem every day, trying to write this would just have been, painstaking, because not only do I find it hard to fathom, but it's very hard to actually, but it'll be very hard to get an interest in it. But for some reason, there's a lot of things in the world that you're just not going to, this is my advice, that you're just not going to be interested in. Try to gravitate away from those things. And for some reason, I don't know why the ideation comes into our membrane, I guess, but there's two or three subjects that you're probably either passionate or probably have a certain fascination about. And there's some things that everyone's probably fascinated about. Like, for example, is there life on other planets? Everyone's fascinated about that. But then there are other things that I think people are potentially have absolutely little fascination about. That's why people do not follow it. But than if it's something that you follow specifically, just kind of, go with that and just kind of, envelope and continue into that field and just see essentially where you can, what you can dig up in, in that field.
It's easier said than done until you're in school and you have to pass your classes,
which is hard,
to get to the next grade, to get to college, to get to something. So that is, it makes sense, because I was that person where I should have never graduated from high school, because I was social butterfly. I was captain, club owner, whatever. I was everywhere. I was like president, whatever. I was like part of all these things. And when it was time for high school graduation, and my mother gets a phone call, like she didn't turn in a certain amount of papers. And I'm like, well, that's obnoxious. Like, how did I not do that? Because I was socializing. And I mean, I have like a really, really close friend that he was valedictorian during our MBA class, and I was class president again. And he's like studying, he's valedictorian. And he's like, because you're not studying and you're not, I'm like, I go, I'm studying, I'm passing. You have to get a B- to pass an MBA. You can't get anything lower than that. You have to take a class over. But guess what? We had the same MBA, dude. So there. I mean, so that was my rationale where like I go, I can get to the mustard where there were classes, like, I mean, economics, I love economics. I couldn't pass. It was horrible. I mean, I paid a ridiculous amount of money to tutors to make sure that I passed that class. But I mean, and again, it fascinates me because I travel and I see other countries, but the class itself didn't fascinate me. So piggybacking on what you're saying is there's other ways once you get older to that class that you despise, and maybe because it was the person that was trying to execute it just didn't do a great job, and then you bring some fun into it. So when I'm thinking about U.S. politics, I'm like, oh my God, I'd rather eat mud. And then you have trivia, and I'm thumbing through it, and I'm laughing. I'm laughing because I'm seeing things, because they are the most obscure things about politics that most people wouldn't think about. And so that's why I love the fact that this should be in a classroom for that kid that's like, oh my God, for the love of God, please don't make me sit through this poli-sci class or this US history. But then you put this in their hands and you get a group of kids to talk about it. It makes them think differently. So I just love how you said, pick that one topic, but you can make that undesirable, the less desirable class be desirable through a different way of teaching. So, and that's what I liked about this a lot. Switching gears a little bit, because you are my keeper of history. Pandemics.
Yes.
Pandemics. And so, and I've said pandemics with an S throughout the current pandemics, as well as pandemics of history. We call it the political crazy town that we're living in right now, where people are so divided, which I've never, and I was in politics, I've never seen people so divided, number one. We have Black Lives Matters. We have the economics, in regards of the economics of what will this do to us in regards to the supply chain. We have so many ripple effects of the economics. And then of course we have the actual disease. And so taking all the pandemics that we're seeing all within 18 months, under 2 years, all these pandemics, and then related to all the different pandemics that we've had in the past, where do we go from now? I mean, what do you predict? I should say predict. Where do you believe we should go to make sure that there is a future? Because right now, 1-2 pandemics every couple of years, people can juggle. I feel like we have a hodgepodge of pandemics in a bowl, and their heads are spinning. So what happens now?
Yeah, it was a little different than you remember the Mitt Romney Shannon O'Brien debate race.
And my God, I was there. I remember it very well.
Everyone thought that was divisive. I remember the ads with the dog
leading in. Do you want to see my tattoo? Oh yeah.
Oh yes.
I remember it very well. Like the entire room. I was there. I was like the field producer, and the entire room was like, oh, and we're like, she just.
Yes, and that and that was interesting because essentially she was asked her view. It was a question about abortion, and she was trying to make a joke, and she says, "Oh, do you want?" And the question, I think Tim Russert said something.
Tim Russert asked about would you let your daughter get a tattoo?
And then she says, "Do you want to see my tattoo?" And then everyone looks, and they're saying, "Where did that come from?"
Yeah.
Yeah. And that was a very, now it looks tame, but at the time people were thinking, it was a very bitter campaign. And that was, I mean, that was, it really was, it was an interesting campaign. And it was, well, you go back all the way. I mean, people thought that Jane Swift was going to run, and then Jane Swift, and then Mitt Romney comes into the race. And then all of a sudden, you know, everyone thought, wow, he's.
But going back, I mean, let's focus on the pandemics and all the history. So like, I mean, like all the pandemics of the past, I mean, like literally like you, I mean, you're the keeper of all this knowledge, all the past. And then now we're in a 2-year bubble of all, I mean, like everything is in one bowl. What happens now? Because it's pretty ugly. I mean, this is ugly.
I actually think that we will get through this. And I think there, if you know, Mark Twain said, if history doesn't always repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And I think the area of similitude is between now and the 1960s. Okay. So essentially you had, I mean, there wasn't an actual pandemic, but there were certainly political pandemics. So I think that was kind of an inflection point in our history. So Lyndon Johnson comes in 1963 and proposes all these social programs, the quote unquote Great Society. You had Medicare, you had Medicaid, you had education reform, you had the Rat Extermination Act, then there was Civil Rights Acts. And this was something, first of all, that was divisive between the North and the South. I mean, for example, if you look at it, every single Democrat, United States senator in the North, except Robert Byrd from West Virginia, voted for the Civil Rights Act. Every Democrat in the South, except for Ralph Yarborough of Texas, voted against it. So that was something that was very divisive. And then 1964, 1965, you have right versus left. Then 1966 to 1969, his last 3 years in office, you have Johnson's support of the war in Vietnam versus those on the left wing of the Democratic Party, or those who had left the Democratic Party, some of them were socialist, communist, even anarchists, who absolutely hated Johnson because of the Vietnam War. So there was so much divisiveness to the point that, you know, Johnson's the Secret Service told him that unless you're in military installations, we warn you that if you go somewhere, it's going to be very dangerous. So if he goes to a college campus, there's going to be protests everywhere. He goes down the South, there's going to be protests from Southern segregationists. And then so you had the Vietnam War, you had civil rights, and you had social programs all kind of at the same time. So what happened? Essentially, once Vietnam ended, and once the country somewhat acclimated or inured to civil rights, by about 1976, you had this kind of electoral equilibrium where the Democrats nominate Jimmy Carter, a center-left Democrat. Republicans nominate Gerald Ford, a center-right Republican, and the country comes back somewhat to where they were prior to the Johnson presidency. But the one thing it did leave, and this was Johnson and Nixon as well, was an incredulous attitude toward what government is. Prior to the 1960s, people generally, believe it or not, had positive views of institutions of government, of corporations. A lot of that changed because of Vietnam, because of Watergate, but we've kind of gone to this equilibrium. And it's interesting because if you go back to the 60s, back to the late 60s specifically, you could not be depoliticized if you were 18 years old because you had the fear that you're going to be drafted. If you just finished your undergraduate degree, you're immediately thinking about, is there a way I can afford to go to grad school so that I can get a deferment so that I don't go to Vietnam? Or you're thinking, should I go over to Vietnam? If I don't go over to Vietnam, will someone go in my place? That's something that you're thinking of, whether you like politics or you don't. Today, there are millions and millions of Americans who have a peripheral interest in politics, and we all know this, or have no interest whatsoever, and can generally live pretty adequate lives with barely even thinking or even knowing who's involved without voting. You didn't have that in the 1960s because there were so many transmogrificational changes right now. And also, you got to remember this, on the post-pandemic, so much of this politics is based not necessarily on issues, but it's based on personalities and affinity groups. It's come down to the point is, do you like Donald Trump? Do you like the Democrats? Do you like Joe Biden? Do you like Bernie Sanders? These are individuals. This is not some cause that people are necessarily rioting in the streets about. It's just simply become divisive because obviously you have affinity groups, and the affinity groups on the left and affinity groups on the right. And I think that that's a lot better when you have people that just want to be associated with this sole individual than people who are actually interested in politics because of the way that it directly concerns their lives, like it did in the late 60s.
All right, so then let's just jump into we'll call the social inequities as well as the financial turmoil.
Yep, the financial turmoil. Obviously, you had this in going back to 1837, then you had it in the 1890s, and that was where you had a lot of changes in the 1890s. That's where the Democratic Party became liberal. because Grover Cleveland was the incumbent president. He would do nothing about the Panic of 1893. So by 1896, William Jennings Bryan, 36-year-old orator from North Platte, Nebraska, comes in and says the Democratic Party, you know what, we should spend more money. We should get off we should oppose the gold standard, and we should have a protective tariff. And ever since then, there's been a conservative and liberal bloodline within the Democratic Party. Then certainly you had it in the 1930s in the Hoover administration, and then you had 2008. But eventually, the country did come after that financial crisis. Now, in terms of certainly the inequities, that is something, and that's something that certainly these times are going to be remembered for. And again, very similar to what was going on 1964, 1965, when you had the debates over the Civil Rights Act, and at the time, you had marches in Selma with John Lewis, and it was something that there was change that, in a sense, I remember Malcolm X talked about at the time. He said, it's either going to be the ballot or I don't remember us being there, but it's either going to be the ballot or the bullet. And it was very similar to what was going on now, because essentially there are certainly groups that are kind of rising up that you would never think would necessarily be interested. And the point that even Black Lives Matter is having their rallies in Wyoming, Nebraska, North Dakota, places that you never would expect that there would be rallies for Black Lives Matter. And I think part of it is because it's become more mainstream. It's not seen as this kind of, oh, that's just a faction over there. Or that's just a faction, they're just a fringe group. That's, don't listen to them. They're now becoming more mainstream to the point that you have folks like Mitt Romney, for example, a Republican, marching in a Black Lives Matter rally. I mean, this is really, it's so much become mainstream. And the same thing, by the way, happened with civil rights. Can you imagine even the most conservative member of the United States House or Senate today saying that they would have voted against the Civil Rights Act of 64 or the Voting Rights Act of 65? If they did see that, they would be seen as a very much of a fringe figure, and no one would take them seriously. I think Black Lives Matter is so mainstreamed and permeated into our society that 25, 30 years down the road, they're really going to be seen as something, it's very mainstream, as opposed to this kind of, as opposed to a fringe group. And I'll just say one more thing, Martin Luther King Jr., he was assassinated in 1968. His disapproval rating in this country, remember, as we look at him now, people look at him now like he was very popular. It was 66%. He was very unpopular in this country. Now we look at Martin Luther King Jr., and if anyone disavows Martin Luther King Jr., then they're part of a very, very small fringe. And I think Black Lives Matter will become very mainstream as it continues.
Yeah, that's I was going to say that. I was listening to a podcast about Ken Burns, and Ken Burns was talking about Muhammad Ali, where he was the greatest fighter of all time until he decided to become Muslim, and then everyone was like against him, and then he found a way to turn that around, and then he died the most beloved person out there.
Well, he's interesting too, because also Vietnam, he would not go to serve in Vietnam. At the time, he said, he would say essentially, no Vietnamese called me, and then essentially he used the N-word. Interesting. But then with Muhammad Ali, though, he really became mainstream to the point that by 1984, he supported Ronald Reagan's re-election campaign. I mean, imagine that. He is somebody who was seen as a fringe member. He said, well, Ronald Reagan supports prayer in schools. He supports God. So that's essentially enough for me. But he was someone that, George W. Bush would meet with. He was someone that Republicans and Democrats would meet with. And you go back to the Muhammad Ali of 1966, 1967, he was seen as kind of, almost as being this far left figure. They're saying, I remember Jackie Robinson, for example, coming out and says, I don't have many heroes, but I love everything about Jackie Robinson. His story, everything about him. And it's not the baseball part of it. It's just like the being of the class, the classiness of this man and what he stood for in regards of one of the people I see. I love everything about him. But what's interesting? Do you know that he wasn't actually the first African-American baseball player?
Who's the first?
Fleetwood Walker in the 1890s. And they would not let him stay in hotels. So he would literally have to stay outside while his team was staying in hotels. And I think Cap Anson, one of the managers of the other team, was very racist against him. But it's kind of interesting because they do have a day for him in the town where he was born in Ohio. But he's kind of been forgotten to history in many respects. But he was somebody who actually played in the 1880s, 1890s, and he played actually before Jackie Robinson. If you ever look into his story, it's fascinating.
The pandemic, the disease.
Yes. Well, I think that obviously the closest we can have is the closest similitude would probably be 1918 when we had this, essentially the same thing virtually. You had masks, people wearing masks, and masks was something that became kind of a huge issue. Do you wear a mask? Do you not wear a mask? Do you trust the government? Do you not trust the government? But also at the time, remember, you also had war. You had World War I, essentially in 1917, and that was something that kind of actually overshadowed the crisis at home. So it shows that we have been there before. But then by the 1920s, right after the whole pandemic, right after the war, we had times of what Warren Harding called, return to normalcy, where the economy was generally, there was a recession at the beginning of the 20s, but later in the rest of the 20s, up until the Great Depression, the economy was generally, going on all cylinders. People were generally pretty happy. It was called the Roaring 20s. So I think we will get into a time where, like the 20s, the 1950s, I think in the 1990s were probably the three best times of the last century, because there were just so few issues, to the point that in 97 and 98, Bill Clinton was looking for issues to deal with, because everyone was so satisfied. His job approval rating was like 65%. It was very hard for him to galvanize around any issue, because people were essentially saying, don't rock the boat. So we have to talk about things like school uniforms and curfews and stuff that you would never hear a president actually talking about. Or he'd give these radio addresses, and these radio addresses, he'd talk about how he just got money to fund cell phones, literally, for neighborhood watchdog groups. I mean, imagine Joe Biden calling a press conference and doing a radio address to talk about cell phones for neighborhood watchdog groups. But it's happened the same thing. Eisenhower in the late 50s, and certainly Coolidge in the 20s. The economy was generally roaring. Obviously, there are pockets of poverty, and there are certainly issues to be dealt with. But I think my guess is in the next decade or so, we'll have at least a decade, not this next decade, the decade after that, where we'll generally have peace and prosperity. But obviously, there are certainly going to be hurdles, and there's certainly obviously going to be natural disasters. I don't think there'll be a pandemic. It might be something similar to that, but I think we will get through it, and we do get through it, and it becomes part of, and times like this are essentially in the rearview mirror, like the 1960s.
We didn't talk about one last pandemic, the climate.
Yes. Well, that is something. So it's interesting. So in the United States, there are, and it's different than in a lot of countries, because there are a lot of quote unquote climate skeptics. And they're not skeptical about the idea. There is a fringe that's skeptical about the idea that there is climate change. I think what they're really skeptical about is anthropogenic climate change, meaning they do not believe.
I'm sorry. You just threw a big word out there. What?
Anthropogenic.
What is that?
It's the belief that humans are causing climate change. There are people that believe it is caused by sunspots, is caused by something else, or that its effects are de minimis upon society, and it's essentially something that you kind of have to mitigate. But then there are people in the right that are starting to believe, there are some people on the right that are starting to believe that it is something that you deal with. And certainly I think the left is pretty much unified in terms of it being a crisis. I think as far left, the further left you get, the more they are to think it's something you have to do about it. Noam Chomsky, for example, is certainly an advocate, but in terms of what you actually do about the climate crisis, it is something that I think people are going to look back, and they're going to look back on this time and say, what essentially did the world do about it? I don't know what the actual answer is. But I do know that, I just know that people do have to look at the fact that there are kind of two sides in the United States. And if you're on the right and you essentially say that climate change is man-made, that you become somewhat of a pariah right now. And I don't know how you kind of overcome that somewhat. But if you're on the left, imagine being on the left. And there are some people, there is a small faction on the left that say, oh, this is all about corporations, or they'll say something like, the scientists are being paid to make this argument. But beyond that, I don't know what you actually do. Obviously, Joe Biden supported going back to the Kyoto protocols, but to the Paris Peace Pact, by the way, but the Paris Pact, but it's obviously, it's certainly a very contentious issue in this country. And it's very much of a cultural issue too. I think the more conservative you get, the more rural you get, you're more likely to think that this is all kind of a scam or whatnot. And certainly the more urban you are, I think the more kind of cosmopolitan you are, you're likely to think this is this is the transcendent cause of a generation. It's a fascinating topic.
When you are being asked, when you're on a book tour, or when you are having conversations, like when you're brought in by the media, are they using you as a resource because you're the keeper of the knowledge of the history, or are they combining in regards of because I'm seeing that how you can weave the present to the past. I love that. I mean, a perfect, in my mind, a perfect historian can actually like see what happened, see what's happening right now, and then see what's happening in the past and put it together. So are people using you as a resource of like, can you just walk us to the point where we can see the future goals, or are they just like using you as like a thesaurus, not a thesaurus, like a historical book, and that's it? I mean, so how are people using your knowledge? How are people using your books to actually, like, how are they using it? I'm just gonna say that. How are they using you, and how are they using the book?
Usually they're using it in a little bit different context than you're using it, but essentially it's not so much about where are we going in the future, but sometimes it's about compare what's going on right now. Have there ever been examples of something similar to this? For example, they asked me about the infrastructure plan, and obviously you say, okay, well, has there ever been a time where there's been such expansion of the social safety net? So again, you go back to the New Deal under Franklin Roosevelt, the Great Society under Lyndon Johnson, and you talk about kind of the differences and kind of the debates at that time and what they were, essentially what the opposition was. And I talk about how back then the opposition wasn't Republican versus Democrat. It was usually Southern Democrat versus Northern Democrat, and Western Republican versus Northern and Northeastern and Midwestern Republican. Now it's generally Democrat versus Republican, because the parties have just been becoming so ideologically homogenous. So that's usually what they ask me. I like these questions though, in terms of where we're actually going, because I can usually, as I say, if history repeats itself and doesn't, but it doesn't repeat itself, but does rhyme, and you can see essentially, this happened in the 20s, or this happened in the 1960s, then what happened after that, and you kind of project what potentially could happen.
Okay. When you're not like researching books, when you are not literally just just sharing all this content all the time. I mean, because like literally, like whenever I see you in town, like we were talking about things, and we always end up talking about politics, but then we move away from things, and then we do the dance. What do you do for fun outside of this? Outside of just and I know it's your niche, it's your thing, it's your passion. Because for me, it's photography. And people are like, I go, do you ever not take a photo? I'm like, yeah, I go running in the dark so that I can just go out and run and come back. And hopefully the coyotes and the skunks and whatever we're dealing with in our neighborhood doesn't bother me. But I know myself that I cannot go out without taking at least 10 photos. It's my binky. I cannot not do it. So how do you turn off?
And now a message from our sponsor. Since 2017, the Foundation for Business Equity has existed to support Black and Latinx-led companies in reaching their full potential by providing access to critical growth tools that include expanded networks, capital, and markets. To learn more about the Foundation for Business Equity, FBE, visit fbequity.org. And now, back to our guest.
Yeah, I mean, it's I guess it's easier than you might necessarily think, because your mind only has so much time to occupy one subject, I guess. So, I mean, certainly you see me out with Parker, that's one thing. I certainly, I certainly like to go out and socialize, which is something, by the way, you're talking about, growing up, I'm kind of the opposite. Back then, I hated to socialize, and I always would sit in the back of the classroom and wait for the class to pretty much be over so I could get out of there. But it's so much different now, because I do like to go out and socialize, and I do like to go out and talk to people, and I do like to walk, and I do like to do that type of stuff. And certainly going to, to Crocker Park obviously is one of them. But yeah, I mean, you definitely can turn it off. And obviously when you're in a conversation with people, sometimes, by the way, you don't always, I don't want to talk about politics, but sometimes you'll have people that would just come up, and whether they know you're into it or not, they just want to kind of give their talking points or give their spiel for whatever reason. And in which case, usually when I do that, I just kind of, I nod my head, because I don't want to debate them. I don't really particularly want to talk to them. I don't necessarily see, kind of what they're trying to go for, other than just trying to convince me of something, or try to think that I'm part of, some sort of an affinity group. So usually you just kind of, nod your head and very politely, and then you're thinking about how somebody can come over and talk to you, or how you can somehow change the subject. And I do that sometimes when people just want to, kind of give their litany or whatnot. I'll try to change the subject, and sometimes that works, but sometimes it doesn't. But I'm not necessarily thinking about always wanting to have a political dialogue with every, humanoid I see.
How did you spend your pandemic vacation or pandemic pause, whatever way you want to say it. I mean, like, so like for me, being a Haitian kid, we were never allowed to go out. So everyone's like, oh my God, are you okay? Are you okay? I go, are you kidding me? This is my happy place. I mean, even with my personality, being home all day long, I can find 10 zillion things to do because I was never allowed to leave the house. So how did you spend your moment of pause / your moment of your pandemic vacation?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's kind of I guess not. Same thing. I didn't really do that much different. You know, it's not like we're locked down, like we can't leave our houses. You can still go out. You can take a long walk. You can look at the ocean. There's things you can actually do. I think it'd be a lot different if you're literally, you know, inside, like you're in a penitentiary and you're by yourself. But, you know, also it's not like I live, you know, somewhere in rural Maine where there's nobody around you. I mean, there are people everywhere, and within a 1 mile radius near where we live, you see people pretty much everywhere. Just the difference is you're with your mask and you're 6 feet away, but there really wasn't this, you know, discordant divergence between the two.
Did you add anything to your life that you would have never done before?
I don't think so. No, it really wasn't. Other than the
what,
fact
you didn't make bread? What, you didn't cook something? What?
No, I did. I don't think I did. I can't think of anything that was all that much different, other than the fact that obviously, like anyone else, you're depressed because you can't actually necessarily go into certain places. But as I say, you're still, I mean, when you live in a place where everyone's within a mile radius, you're still actually seeing human beings, and you're seeing that there are people. You can go for it. You're still allowed to go for a drive. You can see that there are actually people out there. So to that extent, the life was generally homeostasis.
What's the next book? Because as you were talking, I'm like, he needs to do one with the celebrities and he needs to do one with sports and celebrities. Sports, athletes and the history and the U.S. history, and celebrities in the U.S. history. I go, because as you were talking, I'm like, he knows it. I know he knows it. So, I mean, I feel that you need to like go that route as well, because it's like, I feel like there's like parts of this book that should have, they intertwine. I mean, the Marilyn Monroes, the Ronald Reagans. I mean, there's like such intertwining of athletes, Muhammad Ali with history, as well as with celebrities with history. So what's the next book? Although I just gave you 2. You don't have to pay me. I'll give that to you. But what is the next book? What's book number 6? And how long of a gap before book number 6?
That's interesting what you said, because there actually is a lot in there about sports and about celebrities. But
no one's going to look for it because people are going to see the thing. People like, the tunnel vision of you being the kid in the back of the room thinking like, get me out of here. Let me focus on what I like. Same thing with people that love sports will only focus on sports. They're not going to go digging for it.
But there is a section. There's a section specifically about celebrities commenting about politics.
Wait a second. I'm looking. Wait a second.
It's toward the very end.
There's a section on first ladies. Very happy about that. Political dirty tricks, which I like that. Oh, so at the bottom. It's always the bottom, dude. It's like
to save the best for last.
On about celebrities commenting about U.S. politics versus celebrities intertwined in it. So commenting is a whole different thing. That's like Kanye West saying something. I want to know how, and mind you have Kim Kardashian inside politics now. She's like part of the history of you being like going to the president and literally getting someone off. So there are people that would like want to, I'm telling you, that's where you go. But again, I'm not putting ideas into your head. I'm just saying athletics, and we'll call it, and athletics and celebrities. And think about the Olympics. Olympics and politics, it's there. Social inequalities, it's there. Again, not putting ideas into your head. But what's your next book? What's the next idea that's stewing? I know this one just came out, but what's the one that's stewing? And do you not have anything and you're just waiting for someone to say something, a buzz, a conversation for that idea to pop up?
No, I will say just quickly in terms of, I do one of the things for celebrities commenting about politics, and I try to integrate them when during the debate over the Affordable Care Act, Snooki came out because she was opposed because there was
I remember that.
There was a standing tur tax, and she thought it was done specifically, for her. So she came out. What that shows is how parochial politics is. Someone who would not normally be interested in politics, if something directly affects you. In her case, the fact that she likes to go tanning, and all of a sudden, she becomes galvanized. That shows how something. people, it's not necessarily an intellectual endeavor. I mean, she really, I mean, this is something that, you know, really affects her. She really wants to go to those tanning booths, and now she has to pay.
I love it. Snooki is like that's the best part. But even like thinking about we'll call it little, not little, I was gonna say who am I thinking about?
Little Kim.
Yep. Another person. I mean, all over for Biden. And so it is one of those moments where you're seeing all the older, I mean, like you're looking at the Marilyn Monroe and the history there, and then it just intertwines into like all the celebrities, like where when there's like a political campaign, all the celebrities that they pull in, and like all the individuals that are verbally talking and verbally going door to door. I mean, so it is one of those moments where the book would stand out. I'm just telling you.
Well, I think that generally speaking, the best way, if you're ever thinking about who you're going to vote for president, make a list of all the celebrities, make a list of athletes and actors, and do A-list celebrities, B-list celebrities, C-list and D-list, and then add it all up, and whatever it quantifies to at the very end, that's the person that you vote. That's the person that you vote for. I think you need to have this like mathematical formula. So obviously, folks like reality stars are at the top. Then have athletes coming in second, and then some athletes, for example, Kurt Schilling might be more powerful than say Alan Embry. So you go through this whole thing, and then at the very end, you make that. That's the way an informed voter should essentially vote. And I think that's what we should teach young people in terms of just making their decisions. Now, in terms of another book, I actually am working on a book, and it's more or less it's somewhat a philosophy book, actually. Okay. It's about things that kind of in life that I find fascinating, that kind of like don't necessarily make sense, or why we look at things the way we do. For example, everybody wants to be, here's just one example. For example, everyone wants to be number one.
Yep.
Now you look at the number one, though, it looks like a stick.
Mm-hmm.
Then you look at the number three. The number three is so more creative. It goes like this, it goes like this, it goes like this. Just once, I'd like to see a coach come in at the beginning of the season and they say, what's your goal? Say, our goal is to come in third place. Now, I think third place is probably harder than to come into first place, because you have to determine how many games you're going to win, how you're going to get exactly into third place. And that would probably make it be a lot more complicated. But for some reason, we have this fascination with number one. So I have all these things, kind of ideations that formulate in my head, and I keep writing down. I've got like 100 pages of it now. And this is all going to become somewhat of a philosophy book where, by the way, I compare where I talk about fields that colleges need to have majors in, because there's so many people that want to do them. Yep. And for example, I think about, I think one of them is how to be a social media influencer. Why is there no field? Why you have philosophy, you have English, you have math? Why
because it's called marketing, friend. It's marketing.
They need to have a program. They need to have a program just for that, or they need a program for how somebody can become a base coach. Mm-hmm. For example, a first base coach program. It pays lucrative amount? Why don't they have a college that just has? Why don't colleges have a major in something like that?
I'll throw another one. I'll throw another one. Like, why isn't there any? Mind you, there's trade for that, but to be a Mason, Masons make a lot of money.
Especially if they're actually members of the Masons too, because then they can meet and they can talk about hiring Masons. But you're right. Mm-hmm. No, Masons are something that's absolutely true. Absolutely, that is something that certainly. Why is there such a de-emphasis on trades versus education? That is something. Mm-hmm. This is more kind of a jocular kind of look at kind of the way that everything that we as a human being, take kind of as we take as rote that we're supposed to do this, but then I always try to think back and always think, why is this? Why do humans want to be happy? Why do humans want to laugh? Mm-hmm. All this, for some reason, it's just stuff I always kind of wonder about, because there's so much we're supposed to say, you're going to do this, you're going to do this, you're going to do this. And other things just, kind of come to my head. Like example, I saw a sign that said private driveway. Yeah. And I'm thinking to myself, that's interesting. That's really nice that someone would allow a military private to come into their driveway and park there, not a general, not an admiral, but only for a private. And I want to see a private coming into there.
Okay. In a uniform. You're just stretching it. You're just stretching it. But I am going to say one more thing, because I have one more thing before the last question that I have for you. Yes. Do you ever get to the point where you're like, I'm kind of bored with this. I'm kind of done.
Yes. Sometimes you get bored. It's more not necessarily that I don't want to do it. It's more your thoughts. Sometimes you're thinking, I'm just thinking so much about politics to the point that, if you're on an airplane, for example, and you're reading a book about politics, or you're watching it on the TV, and all of a sudden you're just thinking, I really want to think about something else. I want to talk to somebody about something else. I want to talk about gossip. I want to talk about, the small things in the small things in the world. I don't necessarily want to have my mind so kind of monomaniacal. And that's when you think about things like,
well, also
like
you just don't want to be one dimensional. I mean, like there's so much that this world has to offer. And also, yes, you create books on politics, but you start going in all these other quotes from all these different people. So there's no way you could have done that if you haven't spread yourself out to learn other things. I mean, it makes what you do that much richer because, corny, rich. Sorry. But it makes the books stand out a little bit more because you are adding celebrities, you are adding athletes, you're learning about other cultures, like Snooki. Come on, like you threw in Snooki into, so, I always tell people, when people always say, like, I go, you don't own a TV. I'm like, I don't. They're like, why? I'm like,
really?
I don't own a TV.
Wow.
I know, yeah. I can find it anywhere. Pop culture can be found everywhere. But you see me outside as well. I love being outdoors. But the thing is, I know I can get the information without watching. I mean, I never watched The Sopranos, but I know the premise of it and I know how it ended. So
I agree.
So I love learning a little bit about everything because I always say to everyone, you always want to be at least 5% smarter than the person next to you. And in order to do that, all you have to do is learn something. That morning, that afternoon, you just learn something and engage in conversation and get that wow factor. Like, wow, how'd you know that? I'm like, I took that moment of time to be that 5% smarter than you today. I may not be 5% smarter than you today. Tomorrow, you might be 5% smarter. But I go out of my way to learn. I'm a sponge and I'm curious and I'm not afraid to walk up to people and just constantly ask, what is this? What is that? What does it taste like? And can I try? I'm just not that. I'm curious and I think that's one of the things that I'm hearing from you. You're curious and you fit into this little nice pocket. You're a niche. I'm curious and I fit into photography and small businesses. So it's like a bonus for anyone that engages with us. Okay, so I've taken. I'm sorry, go ahead.
To say, in some respects, too, it's kind of a delicate balancing act. On some respects, you want to be a contrarian, but in other respects, you do have to abdicate to kind of the rest of where society is. So it's it's all a delicate balance.
Yeah, absolutely. Our last question, and before I even ask the last question, I'm going to say that I think you're my first person that ever wore a tie. Like, all right, Rich
Really?
never wears a tie. He never wears a tie. He came on a camera. I'm like, oh, why are you dressed up for? This is weird. This is it's me. So yeah, tie. I like that you wore the tie.
It's standing operating procedure. When I do interviews, I put this on and I have this background. But normally I was either going to do this or I was going to have a clock like Flava Flav, one of the two.
Oh, you were not, you liar. You're such a goofball. All right. So my last question to you that I ask of everyone, no matter how many times you are on this beautiful podcast, is if you had a personal ask and a professional ask, what would be your personal ask? And what would be your professional ask of anyone that's listening to you right now?
Yes, that's a great question. So basically, this book has just been out for 2 weeks and I'm starting the book tour. So I'm trying to get every possible appearance that I possibly can, whether it's speaking, whether it's television, whether it's radio, and certainly I can talk about the book. I can make politics interesting. And I can also talk about, like we did here, I can talk about politics in general and compare history to contemporaneous times. But if you have any interest whatsoever in your own podcast or just have me on for any sort of a segment to promote the book or talk about anything else, I'm certainly game for that.
Okay. Was that the personal or the professional?
That was both. That was an
amalgamation. No, you can't have two answers. No.
Okay, that was personal then. Okay, no, that was professional.
That was professional. All right. So what's your personal?
My personal would be, and I would say to try to. Okay, can I repeat what I just said and change the word? It's very similar. Just I'm trying to get my book kind of out there as much as possible, and I'm trying to get my brand out there as much as possible, which would benefit me personally.
Okay. All right. Well, all right. I'll take. It's sort of kind of cheating, but I'll take that. I'll take it. So I'll just say that professionally, the book, personally, your brand.
Yes.
See,
bingo.
I hear you. This is good. Rich, thank you. And you know what? This worked out really well because I had spoke to Rich about being on the podcast a while back, but the timing was like I was doing a lot of other things with the podcast. The timing is perfect because the book, look at that. Did you see that? Timing is everything, my friend.
Timing, just like in politics and just about in politics, certainly when it always works out, because think about it this way. Here's a perfect example why timing is everything in politics. So in 1991, George H.W. Bush had a 91% job approval rating. So what happens? Democrats, Al Gore, Joe Biden, Dick Gephardt, Jesse Jackson, Lloyd Bentsen all say, I'm not going to run for the Democratic nomination because Bush is going to win. Bill Clinton comes out and says, you know what? Even though he made a promise in 1990 when he ran for re-election as governor that he would not run in 92, he looks at the political landscape and he takes a listening tour of his state and he says, basically, the people of my state have said that I could do more as president for the state than I can as governor. So he says he's going to run for president. Very few people thought he was going to win, but you know what? He had a very much attenuated field. He had a weakened field. So he gets in there and then the economy sours. George H.W. Bush's job approval goes down to 38%. And what happens? Bill Clinton wins the presidency, something that I think someone like Al Gore, Mario Cuomo, or Lloyd Bentsen could have done. So you're right, timing in politics, like in life, is just about everything.
And what a perfect way to end.
Yes.
Yes. You're awesome, my friend. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I will see you outdoors somewhere randomly walking.
Categorically.
And honestly, every single time before we even stop, every single time I see you, before we even start talking, I'm going to throw out a country. I like that.
Oh boy. Okay.
Oh yeah. So be prepared, because I literally am going to start picking out random countries.
I'm going to learn about Madagascar now.
Well, I know, huh? But I'll start I literally will pick the ones that I've gone to as well as the ones that I'm going to, like in the next 6 months, and and I just want to see what you do with it.
Okay. And I will be ready for the challenge.
Game on. Awesome. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Greatly enjoyed it.
Bye. Bye.